December 5th, 1941. 4:30 in the morning. General Hines Gderion, commander of 2nd Panzer Army, stood in a commandeered Russian schoolhouse 30 kilometers south of Moscow, staring at a map that no longer made sense. Red arrows drawn by his intelligence officers covered the paper. Soviet attacks, dozens of them, all along his front. All at once, his fingers, wrapped in wool strips because proper gloves had run out weeks ago, traced the arrows. Kaluga, Tula, Yelets. Every position his panzers had fought to reach, now under assault. He'd sent the reports to Army Group Center 3 hours ago. No response yet. Outside, the thermometer read -35 degrees Celsius. His tanks wouldn't start. Half his men had frostbite. And now, this. The Soviets weren't supposed to have reserves left. German intelligence had counted them all, tallied their losses, declared them finished. Guderian had written to his wife 2 weeks earlier that the campaign was essentially over. Just mopping up remained. Every general in Army Group Center had believed it. They'd pushed to within 20 kilometers of Moscow's outskirts, close enough to see the Kremlin spires through binoculars on clear days. The city would fall. Had to fall. Then they'd winter in warm Soviet buildings while the broken Red Army dissolved into the snow. But at 4:30 on December the 5th, 100 Soviet divisions attacked along a front stretching from Kalinin in the north to Yelets in the south. Fresh divisions. Siberian divisions. Troops who knew how to fight in winter, wearing quilted jackets and felt boots, carrying weapons that still fired in the cold. They hit the exhausted, frozen German formations that had been attacking for 5 months straight, and those German formations began to crack. General Franz Halder, chief of the German General Staff, received the first reports in his headquarters at the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia at 7 in the morning. He'd been awake since 5, working through the usual morning briefings, when the teletype machine started chattering. Army Group Center, contact reports, Soviet attacks and division strength, multiple sectors. Halder read them twice, his face unchanging, then walked to the map room. The Eastern Front stretched across the wall, a vast expanse of German advances marked in confident blue. Army Group North besieging Leningrad, Army Group South holding Ukraine, and Army Group Center, the tip of the spear, pressed against Moscow itself. Halder had planned this campaign, calculated the ratios, predicted the timeline. By every metric that mattered, the Soviets should have been finished. They'd lost 4 million men since June. Thousands of tanks, thousands of aircraft, entire armies encircled and destroyed. He picked up the phone to call Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commander of Army Group Center. The connection crackled with static. Bock's voice came through thin and distant. "The situation is serious," Bock said. No preamble. "Soviet attacks all along the front, fresh troops. We estimate 15 to 20 new divisions. Our forces are exhausted. Temperatures dropping. I'm not certain we can hold." Halder wrote in his diary that evening, the leather-bound journal where he recorded the war's progress with meticulous detail. "The enemy has launched counterattacks along almost the entire front. Our troops, completely exhausted, are barely able to hold their ground. The crisis has arrived sooner than we thought possible." Crisis. The word appeared in German High Command communications for the first time since the invasion began. For 5 months, the reports had been triumphs, encirclements, breakthroughs, advances. Now, suddenly, crisis. The temperature kept dropping, -37 degrees on December the 6th, -40 on December 7th. German equipment, designed for European campaigns, failed in cascading waves. Tank engines cracked when soldiers tried to start them. Oil turned to sludge. Automatic weapons jammed after 3 shots. The recoil systems on artillery pieces froze solid. Trucks wouldn't move. Horses died by the thousands, their carcasses lining the roads, freezing in grotesque shapes. Guderian sent another report to Bock on December 7th. His 2nd Panzer Army, which had spearheaded the drive toward Moscow, was combat ineffective. Of the 600 tanks he'd started with in June, fewer than 50 remained operational. Not destroyed, just frozen, sitting in fields and forests, useless metal sculptures. His infantry divisions reported 50% casualties from frostbite alone. Men were losing fingers and toes and ears to the cold. Some froze to death in their foxholes overnight, found in the morning still holding their rifles. "I request permission to withdraw to a more defensible line," Guderion wrote. "Current positions cannot be held with available forces in current conditions." Bock forwarded the request to Halder. Halder brought it to Hitler. Adolf Hitler, who had moved his headquarters to the Wolf's Lair specifically to be closer to the Eastern Front, who had followed every kilometer of the advance with obsessive attention, who had overruled his generals repeatedly to push harder, faster, deeper, read Guderion's request in silence. Then he looked at Halder and said, "No retreat, not one step back. The troops will hold where they stand." Halder tried to explain. The troops were freezing. They had no winter clothing. Supply lines stretched hundreds of kilometers through partisan territory. The Soviets were attacking with fresh divisions while German divisions were at quarter strength. A tactical withdrawal would shorten the lines, allow consolidation, save the army for a renewed offensive in spring. Hitler's response entered the historical record through multiple witnesses. Retreat in this cold means abandoning equipment. Abandoning equipment means losing the war. The army will stand fast. Any commander who authorizes retreat will be relieved of command. Stand fast. The order went out on December 16th, formalized and distributed to every unit on the Eastern Front. No retreats, no withdrawals, no tactical adjustments. Hold the current line regardless of circumstances. It was a gamble based on Hitler's belief that the Soviet offensive would exhaust itself, that German discipline would outlast Soviet numbers, that willpower could overcome weather and logistics and military reality. The German generals, trained in the Prussian military tradition that emphasized maneuver and flexibility, received the order with something between disbelief and despair. Guderion read it in his frozen schoolhouse headquarters and immediately requested a meeting with Bock. Bock granted it. Guderion drove north through blizzard conditions, arrived half-frozen, and argued for 2 hours that the stand-fast order would destroy 2nd Panzer Army. "My troops are dying in place," Guderion said, his voice hoarse from the cold. "Not from combat, from weather. They're freezing to death in positions that have no military value. Let me pull back 50 kilometers. Consolidate. Save the army." Bock, himself struggling with the order, could only repeat Hitler's directive. "Stand fast." Guderion returned to his headquarters and continued fighting a defensive battle. His army wasn't equipped to fight. The Soviet offensive, meanwhile, gained momentum. General Georgy Zhukov, commanding the Western Front, had planned this counter-offensive for weeks. He'd husbanded reserves while the Germans exhausted themselves attacking. He'd brought Siberian divisions west by rail, troops who'd trained in winter conditions, who had felt boots and quilted jackets and weapons that worked in the cold. He'd positioned them carefully, waited for the German offensive to culminate, then struck. The German front didn't collapse. That was the terrible thing. It bent and cracked and bled, but it didn't collapse. The stand-fast order, for all its strategic questionability, prevented the kind of panicked retreat that had destroyed Napoleon's army in the same winter landscape 129 years earlier. German units held their positions because they were ordered to, died in those positions when necessary, and created just enough resistance to slow the Soviet advance. But the cost was staggering. Halder's diary entries from mid-December read like a litany of disasters. December 15th. Situation at Army Group Center increasingly serious. 6th Army Corps encircled. 9th Army falling back despite orders. Casualties mounting. December 17th. Enemy pressure unrelenting. Our troops at the end of their strength. Temperature -42 degrees. The generals started falling like dominoes. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding Army Group South, had already been relieved on December 1st for authorizing a retreat in Ukraine. Now the purge reached Army Group Center. On December 18th, Hitler relieved Bock, officially for health reasons, actually for requesting permission to withdraw. Bock, who had commanded the army group that came within sight of Moscow, was sent home. Guderian followed on December 25th, Christmas Day. He'd continued arguing for tactical withdrawals, continued requesting permission to save his army, and Hitler had had enough. Relieved of command, sent back to Germany. 2nd Panzer Army, the formation that had led the charge across France in 1940 and across Russia in 1941, was given to another general who would follow orders without question. General Erich Höppner, commanding 4th Panzer Group, went next. He'd authorized a withdrawal to save his tanks. Relieved of command in January. Stripped of rank. Forbidden from wearing his uniform. The message was clear: obey the stand-fast order or face disgrace. The climax came on December 19th when Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, Commander-in-Chief of the German Army, the highest-ranking officer in the Wehrmacht, resigned. Officially, health reasons. Actually, he had lost every argument with Hitler about conduct of the campaign. Hitler accepted the resignation immediately and announced he would personally assume command of the army. No replacement would be appointed. The Führer himself would command. Halder watched his commander-in-chief depart and realized the implications. Hitler, who had never commanded anything larger than a regiment, who had no formal military training beyond his service as a corporal in the First War, would now make tactical decisions for 3 million men fighting across a front stretching from the Arctic to the Black Sea. The General Staff, the institution that had planned and executed German military operations for 70 years, was now subordinate to a political leader who made decisions based on ideology and intuition. This is the end of military professionalism in the German army, Halder wrote in his diary. He didn't mean the end of the army. He meant the end of the traditional relationship between military expertise and political authority. From December 19th onward, Hitler's will would override military judgment. Always. The Soviet offensive continued through December and into January. Zhukov's forces pushed the Germans back 50 to 200 kilometers, depending on the sector. They liberated dozens of towns and cities. They saved Moscow, but they didn't destroy Army Group Center. The stand-fast order, combined with German discipline and Soviet logistical limitations, prevented the complete collapse Hitler had feared. By late January, the offensive had exhausted itself. Soviet forces had outrun their supply lines. The Germans, despite horrific casualties, still held a continuous front. Both sides dug in for the winter, neither capable of major operations until spring. The German High Command assessed the damage in February. Army Group Center had lost approximately 350,000 men since December 5th. Not killed, though many were. Casualties. Killed, wounded, missing, and frostbite cases so severe the men would never return to duty. Entire divisions had been reduced to regimental strength. The Panzer divisions, the elite formations that had conquered France and driven to Moscow's gates, were shadows of themselves. But they still existed. That was Hitler's justification for the stand-fast order. Yes, the casualties were terrible. Yes, the army had been pushed back, but the army survived. No rout, no collapse, no repetition of Napoleon's retreat from Moscow. In Hitler's mind, his order had saved the German army. The generals who'd wanted to retreat had been wrong. His willpower had prevailed. This interpretation entered German high command thinking and shaped decisions for the rest of the war. When generals requested permission to withdraw from untenable positions, Hitler would reference December 1941. "We held then, we'll hold now." When military logic suggested retreat, Hitler would insist on standing fast. The lesson he learned from the Moscow counter-offensive was that retreat meant defeat, that holding ground regardless of cost was the path to victory. The generals learned different lessons. Guderion, sitting in his home in Germany, wrote in his memoirs that the stand-fast order had been correct in the specific circumstances of December 1941, but disastrous as a permanent doctrine. A one-time emergency measure had been elevated to strategic principle. Halder, still serving as Chief of General Staff, watched Hitler make increasingly erratic decisions based on the belief that willpower could overcome military reality. The relationship between Hitler and his generals, already strained, never recovered. The professionals who'd planned the invasion of Russia, who'd calculated logistics and ratios and timelines, had been proven wrong about Soviet capabilities. The amateur who'd overridden their caution had been proven wrong about the timeline for victory. Each side blamed the other. Hitler believed his generals lacked the will to win. The generals believed Hitler lacked the judgment to command. In the frozen schoolhouse where Guderion had received the first reports of the Soviet offensive, a new German general now commanded 2nd Panzer Army. The maps on the wall showed a front line 50 kilometers west of where it had been in December. Soviet and German forces faced each other across frozen fields, both too weak to attack, both planning for spring. The war would continue for 3.5 more years. The stand-fast order would be repeated in Stalingrad, in Tunisia, in Normandy, in the Ardennes, in Berlin. Every time Hitler would insist that holding ground was more important than preserving forces. Every time German commanders would request permission to maneuver, to retreat, to save their armies. Every time Hitler would reference December 1941. But in February 1942, with the immediate crisis past, the German High Command could only assess what had happened and prepare for what came next. They'd survived the Soviet winter offensive. They'd held the front. They'd paid a price that would have seemed unthinkable 6 months earlier, but they'd survived. Halder's diary entry from February 15th, 1942. The crisis has passed. The army remains intact. But we have learned that our enemy is far stronger than we believed, that this war will be far longer than we planned, and that our relationship with the Führer has fundamentally changed. We are no longer planning campaigns. We are executing orders. That was what the German High Command said in the end, when the Soviet winter offensive began. They said it in reports and diaries and memoirs and letters. They said it in requests for retreat that were denied. They said it in resignations and dismissals and arguments that changed nothing. They said the enemy was stronger than expected. They said the weather was worse than predicted. They said the troops were at the end of their endurance. They said retreat was necessary. And Hitler said, stand fast. The temperature in Moscow rose above freezing in March. Snow melted. Mud season began. The Eastern Front, stretching across thousands of kilometers of Russian landscape, settled into temporary stalemate. Both sides prepared for summer. Both sides planned new offensives. Both sides believed they would win. But something had changed in December. The Germans had learned they could be stopped. The Soviets had learned they could attack. And the German High Command had learned that their professional judgment was subordinate to political will, that military logic would not always prevail, that they would fight this war according to principles they didn't believe in, under orders they couldn't question, until victory or destruction. General Günther von Kluge, who replaced Bock as commander of Army Group Center, surveyed his battered divisions in March and understood what the winter offensive meant. Not just a tactical setback, not just a strategic delay, a fundamental shift in the character of the war. The Blitzkrieg was over. The war of annihilation had begun. And the German High Command, which had planned for one kind of war, would now fight a different kind entirely. In the frozen fields south of Moscow, German soldiers erected wooden crosses over graves dug in ground so hard they'd needed explosives to break through. Thousands of crosses, tens of thousands. The men who died in December believing Moscow would fall, who froze in positions they'd been ordered to hold, who learned in their final hours that the war they'd thought was ending had barely begun. The Soviet winter offensive of 1941 didn't destroy the German army, but it destroyed the German High Command's confidence that they understood how to win this war. It destroyed the relationship between Hitler and his generals. It destroyed the assumption that military professionalism would guide German strategy, and it destroyed the belief, held since June, that the Soviet Union would collapse under the weight of German military superiority. What the German High Command said when the Soviet winter offensive began was this: "We didn't see it coming. We're not prepared. We need to retreat." And Hitler's response, the response that defined German strategy for the rest of the war, was this: "No. Stand fast. Hold the line. Will is stronger than circumstance." 3.5 years later, when Soviet forces entered Berlin and the Third Reich collapsed, historians would trace the beginning of the end to many moments. The failure to take Moscow, the disaster at Stalingrad, the invasion of Normandy. But the moment when the German High Command lost control of German strategy, when military judgment became subordinate to ideological conviction, when the generals who'd conquered Europe learned they could no longer shape the war they were fighting. That moment came in December 1941, when the Soviet winter offensive began, and everything the German High Command believed about the war turned out to be wrong.